When I say the name Laura Palmer, what possibly comes to mind?
A lot of you who grew up through the early 90s may automatically think of the fictional character whose death kicks off the series Twin Peaks, an American drama that aired from 1990 to 1991. Many are quite familiar with the show, but many are not familiar with the story that inspired it. The television homicide of Laura Palmer was actually inspired by a real murder.
One that occurred way back in the early 1900s, 1908 to be exact. Today, we're talking about the case of Hazel Irene Drew.
Hazel Irene Drew was born on June 3, 1888 in Rensselaer County, New York, to parents John and Julia Drew. She was one of several children. Her known siblings were Joseph, Carrie, William, Emma, Emery, and Thomas. So she had a decent-sized working-class family.
Her family did not have a lot of money, but they worked very hard for the little that they had.
In the year 1908, she was making a living as a domestic servant, where she did household chores to make money. Hazel was definitely a hard worker. She had been working since the age of 14.
She worked for a lot of wealthy families, and I mean very wealthy families. And they didn't really look down on her because she didn't come from money. They respected her as much as she respected them.
When she wasn't working, she loved attending church and hanging out with friends. Not too odd for a small-town girl who just left her teenage years behind. People who knew her described her as classy and polite. The thing, though, that captured people's attention was her beauty. There were many gorgeous girls in her town of Troy, but Hazel surpassed most when it came to beauty. Other than her looks, she was also extremely outgoing. She could make friends with almost anyone. She didn't have any known enemies, which is why it was so confusing to people when she was murdered. The lifeless body of 20-year-old Hazel Irene Drew was found floating face down in Teal's Pond near the bottom of Taberton Mountain in Sand Lake, New York. She was found by a group of teenage boys who were hiking in the area.
After examining her nearly unrecognizable remains, there was a conclusion made about her cause of death. Her cause of death was blunt force trauma to the back of her head from an unknown object. Her death was automatically ruled a homicide. The thing about Hazel's murder that still baffles people to this day and has kept people so intrigued by this case for so long is not really the murder itself, it's the strange events leading up to her murder, including her very odd behavior.
For instance, on Friday, July 3rd at 11 p.m., she went to speak to her local dressmaker, Mrs. Shoemaker, someone she knew quite well, the person who made and tailored most of her clothing. Hazel begged her to make her a shirtwaist for her weekend trip to Lake George, saying that she had the money she owed her, plus money for the new shirtwaist she wanted made. Mrs. Shoemaker could see the desperation in the eyes of the girl, so she sat at her sewing machine and made Hazel a new shirtwaist for her upcoming trip. Coincidentally, the same shirtwaist that Hazel would be murdered in.
This trip to Lake George that she was so insistent on getting a shirtwaist made for never actually happened. She never went to Lake George, which is so weird because the first time that it is noted that she told anybody about this trip to Lake George was on June 1st when she told a good friend of hers, Carrie Weaver. So she was murdered on July 7th. The first time she talked about this trip to Lake George was on June 1st. So a little bit over a month she was planning this trip, and then she just completely scrapped the idea and didn't go to Lake George. Also weird that she had been planning this trip to Lake George, and yet she waited until the last minute to get a shirtwaist made for the trip that she wouldn't end up going on anyways.
Instead of going to Lake George, she spent the weekend with her aunt, Minnie Taylor, and her cousins. They all claimed she had been in good spirits, then out of nowhere decided to abruptly quit her job on Monday morning, the 6th of that month. She had been working for a Professor Edward R. Carey and his wife, and quit unexpectedly, apparently right after Mrs. Carey asked her to kindly do the laundry, something she would normally do while working there. She didn't really have any complaints about her job. There were really no issues between her and Mr. Carey. She just quit. That's it. She left their residence at around 10 a.m.
After quitting her job, she literally wasted no time. She packed up a travel trunk and set out. She told her aunt that she was going to visit some friends. But after she was murdered, all her friends, or all her known friends, were questioned and asked if any of them were expecting her, and all of them said no.
Then on Monday morning, somewhere between 11:20 and 11:30 a.m., she spoke to a friend at Union Station in Troy. She ran into her friend, Miss Mary Robinson, and they spoke briefly. Mary said Hazel had her suitcase and was acting like she was expecting someone to meet her there. Hazel asked Mary where she was taking the train to. Mary told her her destination and then asked Hazel where she was headed. Hazel replied, "Oh, down the river." Mary thought that this response was a little vague, so she asked her where down the river. Hazel said, "Perhaps as far as New York," meaning New York City. Then a train was called. Hazel went to the ticket window to buy a ticket and then headed to the train shed to catch her train.
The only train that departed from Troy around that time, the train that she most likely took, well, actually the only train she could have taken if she took a train from Troy at that time, was the Albany local train. The Albany local train was a train that basically went down the river, down to Albany, and made all the local stops in the area. So I want to give you guys a little bit of an idea of location. This is Troy up here. So if she was going to take the train down to Albany, she would have taken it down the river and then got off in Albany, and then of course taken that train line up again to Troy. So this is where Troy is, and this is where Albany is. Rensselaer is where she was born, and all the way over here in Sand Lake is where her body was found. Here's where things get even stranger, because the next time that she was seen was at 1:15 p.m. at the same exact train station. She was seen again at the Troy Union Station a little less than 2 hours later. It is guessed that she did get on the train around 11 to 11:30 and that she made her way down to a stop, most likely the Albany stop. She met up with somebody, or maybe they didn't show up, and then she made her way back up to the Troy Union Station. If her stop was the Albany stop, she would have taken the 12:30 p.m. train back up to Troy. It was never found out who she was going to meet that day, or if she was going to actually meet anyone, or why she took the train at all.
This time, though, when she was seen at the station at 1:15 p.m., she didn't have her suitcase with her. It was checked into storage to have it sent to her parents' home. In the suitcase, they found undergarments, a toothbrush, a nightgown, a comb, a handbag, and a Japanese kimono robe. Inside this handbag, they found a heart-shaped locket, a handkerchief, and a personal from a Troy newspaper from October 7th, 1907 that said, "Edward Lavoie has departed for Chattanooga, Tennessee, where he will remain all winter."
One huge mystery about this case is where Hazel spent Monday night, the night of the 6th going into the 7th, and the 7th was the day that she was murdered. It is unknown where she spent Monday night, if she spent it in a hotel, at some friend's house, at some random person that she met on Monday. It is unknown where she was Monday night. But the next time that Hazel was seen was on Tuesday, the day that she would be murdered, at around 11 p.m. by a Mr. Peter Sipperly.
Peter was an older man, a farmer who lived in Snyder's Lake. He said that around 3 p.m. of the 7th, he boarded a car in Averill Park at the railroad station. He claimed a woman who looked to be in her late teens or early 20s had captured his attention. He said he didn't get a good look of her face, but after seeing photos of Hazel, he was sure the woman he saw on the trolley that day was her. According to Peter, the woman was not alone. She was with a man that he described as being tall with a slim build. He said that the young man with her never seemed to take his eyes off of her. Peter said that the woman had a black straw hat on her lap at the time. If the woman was actually Hazel, who was this man with her that day? This would be still unknown to this day.
To give you guys another idea of location, this is Averill Park. Averill Park is actually located in Sand Lake, and this right here is Taberton Road. Now let's fast forward a few hours. One of the people that helped drag Hazel's body out of the water was a teenager named Frank Smith. As soon as Frank Smith saw this woman's body, he knew it was Hazel Irene Drew, because this woman, although she was pretty much unrecognizable, she was wearing the same clothes that he saw Hazel in 4 days earlier.
Frank Smith and his friend Rudy Gundrum saw Miss Drew around 7 p.m. on July 7th as they were driving down the road in a horse-drawn wagon heading in the direction of town. She was walking along Taberton Road, the road that leads to Teal's Pond. As Frank passed her, she waved and said, "Hello, Frank." He waved back, then turned to Rudy and said, "That's John Drew's oldest daughter."
One thing that stood out to the men about Hazel when they saw her walking is that she was walking, and as she was walking, she was holding a black straw hat with 3 large black plumes sticking out from it. I'm sure a lot of you don't know what plumes are, because I didn't really know what they were until I saw them and I was like, okay, that's what plumes are. But they're basically very large feathers that were very common when it came to hats back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Or even like flappers when they had the headbands and like the huge feathers sticking out from the headbands. That's plumes. Well, this hat that Frank and Rudy saw Hazel carrying that day was the same exact hat that Peter saw the woman with on her lap on the trolley. This sighting of her from Frank and Rudy was the last known sighting of her before her body was found 4 days later on July 11th.
Where the white X is in this photo of Teal's Pond is where her black straw hat with the black plumes was located, along with a pair of her gloves and a stick pin with the letter H on its head.
So now you guys have the backstory. Let's get into some of the things about Hazel and the weeks leading up to her murder that make this case so much more bizarre. Hazel's case was run by a Detective Duncan Kay. He was the person put in charge of this case, and he did a lot to try to piece together everything as much as he could, because this was a very confusing case, especially back then when the advancements in technology were just not where they are in today's time. Before they examined her body in depth and found out her cause of death, they did originally think that she had committed suicide, mostly because after questioning her family and friends and realizing that her body was found only a few days after she randomly quit her job. But of course, after finding out her cause of death and realizing that it was blunt force trauma to the back of the head from an unknown object, obviously somebody else did it and was responsible, they realized that suicide was not the case. They started trying to dive into Hazel's personal life as much as they could and try to figure out who she was as a person and who she knew who may have been responsible. Hazel was a very kind-hearted person. She was very virtuous, but she may have had a little bit of a secret life going on, kind of a Hannah Montana situation. In the show Hannah Montana, both Miley Stewart and Hannah Montana were great people, but the other side of their life was kept a secret, and that's kind of what was going on with Hazel Irene Drew.
One thing is that she lived beyond her means. She didn't make a lot of money as a domestic servant. She was far from wealthy, but she was spending like she was. She would take trips often to places like Boston, Rhode Island, and New York City. She would also spend money to have her clothes tailored, a luxury to most of the working class.
The friend that I was talking about before, Carrie Weaver, the friend that Hazel was talking to about her upcoming trip to Lake George that she had planned, well, Carrie was questioned by police and she had a lot to say. One of the things that Carrie said was she had no idea how Hazel afforded her lifestyle.
She said Hazel would spend evenings on first-class boats. She would take extended vacations. She wore luxurious items of clothing and spent large sums of money just on lunch at fancy restaurants. One would think that maybe she had someone giving her money. Possibly she knew a nice man who made good money and wanted to spoil her a little. According to Carrie, though, Hazel always insisted she had no male friends doing such a thing for her. Carrie once said, I never saw her in the company of a man all the time I was in Troy, and she told me on more than one occasion that she had no sweetheart. Really, Hazel, she could make $1 go further than any woman I ever saw. Going on to say, why anyone should have killed Hazel is more than I can imagine, for she never had an enemy as far as I know. I can give no theory and offer no solution of the crime. Last February, I went to stay at Mrs. A.M. Green in South Troy. This was about 4 blocks from Hazel's place of employment at Professor Carey's. From the time we met, we began to chum together. She was an exceedingly fine girl, good habits, on this end of nice appearance. She was a blonde. The Careys always seemed to think much of her, as did everyone in the neighborhood.
So one of Hazel's really good friends told authorities that she didn't know that Hazel had any sweethearts. But after Hazel was murdered, they looked through Hazel's belongings and found some things that were very interesting. For one, they found a suitcase, and in the suitcase were tons of letters and postcards from admirers. But they couldn't really track down any of these admirers because they were all signed in initials. One of the main initials used in these letters and postcards was a Mr. C.E.S. Who this person was never found out, but the letters that he sent were very endearing.
One reading, your merry smile and twinkling eyes torture me. Your face haunts me. Why can't I be contented again? You have stolen my liberty. Please don't forget a promise to write. When I reach Albany again, I will meet you at the tavern. I must see you soon, or I'll die of starvation.
There were 6 postcards sent from this CES, and they were all either sent from Boston or New York. Coincidentally, both places that Hazel had traveled to not long before she was murdered. So remember before when I told you guys that one of the people that helped drag Hazel's body out of the water was a teenager named Frank Smith? Well, another person that helped was her uncle, a Mr. William Taylor. How I was talking about Minnie Taylor, her aunt, this was her brother, and also her mother's brother, so it was her uncle on her mother's side.
Her uncle lived very close to Teal's Pond. Her uncle was a man who was recently widowed, and he was quite depressed because of this, even attempting suicide at one point. He was looked at as a suspect since he lived so close to where she was last seen and where her body was found, but nothing much came of this. Even though, coincidentally, Hazel was walking in the direction of her uncle's home when Frank and Rudy saw her.
There was not enough evidence to tie her uncle to the crime to say that he was definitely responsible for her murder, but there is a possibility that the day that she was seen by Frank and Rudy, that she was on her way to her uncle's house. She did visit her uncle on occasion.
One main time in her life that she spent a bit of time at her uncle's home was during the winter of 1907 to early 1908. She spent almost a month there completely bedridden and being taken care of mostly by her sister-in-law, Eva. Her brother, Joseph, was also staying at the home with them. When William, Joseph, and Eva were asked about the illness that she had, they all claimed they had no idea what it was. They just tried to get her better. While bedridden, she was also corresponding with friends through letters, and they were all worried about her and this unknown illness. During this entire time, Hazel's parents never came to visit her, and not once was a doctor called. It was theorized that she didn't actually have an illness, but she was recovering from an abortion. One of the friends she was corresponding with was a woman named Mina Jones, and after Hazel was murdered, Hazel's Aunt Minnie reached out to Mina and told her to destroy any letters she had from Hazel during the time she had this strange illness.
I don't know about you guys, but this part of Hazel's past is one of the strangest, most peculiar parts of Hazel's entire story. What makes it even weirder is that it is said that at the time of Hazel's death that she may have been in the very early stages of pregnancy. So it is something to think about. Maybe she wanted to go back to her uncle's, get another abortion done in an area where she didn't really know anybody, and recover there again. And a lot of people are probably thinking, well, you know, it was said that she had an illness, this unknown illness. But you have to think this was the early 1900s. That's kind of the way somebody would have talked about an abortion. It would have been very hush-hush. But let's just go down a different route and say that she wasn't going to her uncle's house. Where else could she have been heading to? There is a possibility that she was going to visit her younger brother.
About 2 miles from Teal's Pond was Libby Sawalski's farmhouse. This is where Hazel's younger brother, Willie, 7 years old, was staying at the time of her murder. Willie had spent the beginning of the summer with his uncle William, but they butted heads, so Willie decided to spend the remainder of his summer break until about late July at the Sawalski home. Willie and Mrs. Sawalski's son were both questioned by authorities and never said they were expecting Hazel to make a stop there, but she may have decided to last minute.
You have to think that this was a time before texting and instant messaging, and if last minute she just wanted to go visit someone, she most likely would have just shown up. There was no way for her to just contact them very quickly and let them know that she was on her way. From everything that I researched about Hazel and how she was as a person and her characteristics and whatnot, even if she could contact the person, chances are she wouldn't. She would just show up. She would just pop in and be like, hey, what up? I'm here. Hazel was a very independent person. She didn't really want or need approval from anybody to do anything. She kind of just drifted her own way, and if she wanted to do something last minute, she was most likely going to do it. We can at least narrow it down that if she was on that road, traveling in that direction, that she was either going to her uncle's or to the Sawalski home to visit her younger brother, because according to her younger brother Willie, she didn't know anyone else in the area. She knew of some people in the area, like Frank Smith, and some people knew of her, but nobody that she was close enough with to go visit.
Another suspicious thing I have to mention is that when it comes to Mrs. Sawalski's son, Michael, he was a 20-year-old boy described by authorities as being not too bright. When he was asked if he was away from the house the night of the murder, he said no, he was at the farm. According to another source, he was away from the house, and he was meeting someone. That person he was supposedly meeting just so happened to be Frank Smith, the one who saw her the day of her murder, and the one who pulled her body out of the water. There's no proof he did meet up with Frank, but it was said that he did. Michael told authorities, I went to Troy on July 6th, but I was not away from the home that night or the next. I did not know Hazel Drew's body had been found until the following Monday, when Willie, who had been staying at our house, told me he was going to Troy to help you look for the murderer.
When Willie was asked about Michael Sawalski and to describe him as a person, he said two things: that he was big and naughty. He said that Michael had a tendency to abuse a lot of the animals on the Sawalski farm. And I'm sure a lot of you guys who are interested in true crime cases know that a lot of killers and a lot of serial killers in general, they usually start out torturing or hurting animals. I'm not saying that Michael was 100% guilty because he had this horrible characteristic of his. I'm just saying that it is something to think about. The next person that we're discussing, and somebody that I'm sure a lot of you guys are thinking of as well, is Frank Smith. Frank was 17 years old, and he was described as being quite dim-witted, and he did not keep it a secret that he had a huge crush on Hazel. Obviously, authorities looked at him as a main suspect at the beginning of this case. He was one of the last known people to have seen her. He had a huge crush on her, and he was one of the people that helped drag her body out of the water when her remains were found. But his alibi completely checked out, and so did Rudy's.
Other than her uncle, Frank Smith, Michael Sawalski, Rudy Gundrum, random people in the area, there were dozens of suspects in this case, from a dentist who proposed to her even though he was married, a train conductor she had supposedly been seeing, to a millionaire resort owner who was rumored to keep sex slaves at his vacation spot near Teal's Pond. Then, of course, there's the mystery man from her letters who they never located. The list literally goes on and on and on, and nothing came of any of it.
This case is just as unsolved in today's time as it was 111 years ago when it first happened. As months turned to years and years turned to decades, the story of Hazel Irene Drew turned into more of an urban legend, a ghost story told around a campfire, than the case of an unsolved homicide.
Co-creator of the television show Twin Peaks, Mark Frost, grew up hearing of the story of Hazel Irene Drew. Mark's grandmother, Betty Calhoun, would tell him as a young boy about the girl from Sand Lake whose body was found floating in Teal's Pond in upstate New York. The story stuck with Mark for most of his life, and when he got older, he decided to actually research into it. Like most people who learn about it, he was immediately intrigued and interested in the cold case. So when he became a television screenwriter, it's no surprise he used the story as inspiration for one of his shows. There are a lot of similarities between Hazel Irene Drew and Laura Palmer, the fictional character in Twin Peaks. For one, both are young, stunning, and have golden blonde hair. Both are brutally murdered and their body washed up on the shore of a small body of water. There are dozens of suspects and everyone is pinned against each other, trying to find out who the culprit is. Both women kept many things a secret, and they lived lives behind the scenes that many found very surprising. Both stories left people questioning the integrity of the individuals around them.
Their stories are nearly identical besides the location, the time period, and the fact that Laura's fictional murder was eventually solved and Hazel's never was. This happens very rare when I'm researching a case, but I have very solid opinions when it comes to Hazel's case. When it comes to most cases that I research, there's so many different theories, there's so many different suspects. I keep a very open mind and I try to see everything from each side. I try to be as unbiased as possible. I can't say that there's a suspect that I 100% think is responsible when it comes to this case, but I do think that I've kind of figured out the events leading up to her murder. That's very rare for me to say, and I really don't think I've ever said that in a video before, where I definitely think I know what happened beforehand. But I'm not saying I'm the only person who thinks this, because a lot of people who do look into this case think this as well. I just have to say that out of every single theory that I've looked into, this is kind of what I think happened in the days leading up to her murder and kind of Hazel's thought process. The first thing that you have to think about is that she had this trip to Lake George planned. She told her friend Carrie Weaver about it on June 1st, and she talked to quite a few other people about it as well, including her seamstress. This was a trip that she had planned, and she had her little heart set on going to Lake George, and then something came up and she didn't go to Lake George. She went to her aunt's instead, and then after that started acting very odd. Instead of going to Lake George, she went to her aunt's house, Minnie Taylor, and she spent some time with her aunt and her cousins. Her aunt and her were very close. There was a little bit of an age difference. Her aunt was in her late 30s, and of course Hazel was 20 years old. Her aunt was somebody that she really respected, somebody that if she was going to go to for advice, that would be the person she would go to. I think that Hazel made plans with somebody, I want to say a man, last minute, and she went to her aunt's instead of going to Lake George so she could kind of prep for this little outing with this person and get some girl time beforehand. I believe that her aunt knew more about the situation and about Hazel's private life than she let on to authorities. I believe that when she wanted this shirtwaist made, she used Lake George as an excuse. I believe that she wanted the shirtwaist made for an outing on Monday with somebody that she knew, most likely one of her admirers. And her quitting her job and just randomly packing up a trunk Maybe she had plans to kind of run away with this person. I think this CES individual is the person that she was going to meet up with because of course they corresponded and talked about meeting in Albany again. Also, the two locations where the postcards or letters were sent from was Boston and New York, two places that Hazel had recently visited. She wasn't visiting family or friends. Chances are she was visiting this CES individual. I think that maybe the person she was with on the trolley was Mr. CES. But I personally do not believe that the CES person was the person who took her life. Mostly because she was seen walking completely alone on Taberton Road by Frank and Rudy. If of course what they said that they saw was completely true and she was by herself. The timeline is very weird, but you also have to think that first-hand accounts are not always 100% accurate. So maybe she wasn't in these locations exactly when some people said that she was. I think that she spent Monday going into Tuesday with this admirer, and then afterwards, maybe she had something planned with them later, but she wanted to go visit her uncle or her younger brother and see them for a little while. Maybe she wanted to visit both and kind of have a little bit of a goodbye before she went off with this person for a bit of time. I don't think that this admirer of hers, whether it was CES or another one, I don't think that they were responsible. I just think that they maybe never came forward because they thought they would be looked at as a suspect because they were a love interest of hers. Of course, that's very selfish to do, but some people do that. For some reason, my eyes do not narrow in on the uncle. I think it's very coincidental that there was a rumor that Frank Smith and Michael Sawalski had met up the night that she was murdered. Someone who had a huge crush on her and somebody who had obvious anger issues. It's a little weird. I'm not saying I think that either one of them is guilty. I'm just saying you have to think about it. Another thing that you have to think about is the fact that the temperature that day was around 95 degrees. This isn't today's time where a girl would be wearing shorts and a tank top and be okay to walk around in 95-degree weather. She was in a full outfit, a full dress. Chances are she wasn't walking that far of a distance, so going to her uncle's or going to the Sawalskis seems like where she was headed. From where she was seen on Taberton Road, whether they may have been involved or not, to either her uncle's, most likely probably her uncle's because it was closer, or the Sawalskis, something happened. If Frank and Rudy were not involved, chances are she was murdered probably an hour after they saw her. I know that my thoughts, my opinions were kind of all over the place, but that's how you have to be with cases like this. But I just 100% think that she didn't go to Lake George because she was meeting up with a guy who was interested in her and she was equally as interested in. But I don't think that this person was the one responsible for her death. But of course, like always, let me know your opinions and your thoughts and your theories and who you think may be responsible down below in the comments. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye guys.